This is the first case on my list that truly blew my mind. And honestly, it might do the same to you. Today we're diving into one of the most disturbing and mysterious cases I've ever covered, the story of Ruth Marie Terry. Ruth Terry was born on the 8th of September 1936 in Whitwell, Tennessee, to Johnny and Eva Terry. Her early life was shaped by hardship after Eva died at only 23 years old. As Ruth entered adulthood, she experienced a short-lived marriage before deciding to leave Tennessee in 1957. She relocated to Livonia, Michigan, where she found work at the Fisher Body automotive plant. In 1958, Ruth gave birth to her son Richard. Financial difficulties quickly made it impossible for her to support him alone. Richard Hanchett Sr., a superintendent at the factory where Ruth worked, agreed to adopt the child in exchange for paying her expenses. After the adoption was finalized, Ruth left Michigan and moved to California, separating herself from the life she had struggled to maintain. Years later, in 1972, Ruth attempted to reconnect with her son. Richard, however, was unable to meet her at that time because he had suffered a drug overdose that left him in a coma for 18 days. The missed reunion became another painful separation in Ruth Terry's life before her later disappearance and death. Her story reflected years of instability, family distance, financial pressure, and personal loss long before investigators identified her publicly. On the 16th of February 1974, Ruth Terry married Guy Rockwell Moldavin in Reno, Nevada. Moldavin worked as an antiques dealer, and within months the couple traveled to Tennessee to visit Ruth's relatives in Whitwell. Family members later recalled that Ruth appeared different whenever she was around him. Her grandniece, Brittany Novangloski, later said Ruth wasn't herself and described Moldavin as possessive during their visit. After leaving Whitwell, the couple traveled to Chattanooga to visit Ruth's half-brother Kenneth and his wife Carol. During the visit, Ruth and Moldavin spoke about plans to travel across the United States searching for antiques. Kenneth later remembered them discussing a possible trip to Massachusetts before they departed. In late summer 1974, Moldavin returned alone to Tennessee and told Ruth's family that she had disappeared from their California home. Ruth's brother James traveled to California and hired a private investigator. The investigator later claimed Ruth had willingly left after becoming involved with a religious cult. Over time, uncertainty surrounded Ruth's fate. She was eventually listed as deceased in family obituaries, while Carol believed Ruth might have entered witness protection. For decades, relatives remained without confirmed answers about her disappearance, relying only on scattered explanations and unanswered questions. On the 26th of July 1974, a 2-year-old girl walking through the Race Point Dunes in Provincetown, Massachusetts, followed a barking dog toward a set of human remains near a road. Investigators arrived and found signs that the body had been there for some time, including insect activity, footprints leading toward the location, and tire tracks discovered nearby. Authorities believe the woman may have died roughly 2 weeks before the discovery. The unidentified woman was lying face down on part of a beach blanket. Investigators reported no obvious signs of a struggle at the scene, leading to theories that she either knew the person responsible or had been asleep. A pair of Wrangler jeans and a blue bandana were found nearby. The woman had long auburn or red hair tied back in a ponytail with a gold-flecked elastic band, and her toenails were painted pink. Police estimated that she stood about 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighed around 145 pounds, and had an athletic build. Her dental work appeared expensive, with several crowns and missing teeth. Investigators also noted severe injuries to her head and neck area, along with the absence of both hands and one forearm. Some believe those missing body parts may have been removed to prevent identification or hide evidence. With no confirmed identity and few investigative leads, the woman was buried in October 1974 after the case went cold. In 2014, one investigator helped raise money to replace her deteriorated casket with a new one. For decades, the unidentified victim became known as the Lady of the Dunes. Investigators continued reviewing reports involving missing women, but no matches were found. The case remained unresolved for many years, while forensic examinations and renewed investigative efforts kept attention focused on identifying the woman discovered in Provincetown during the summer of 1974. After the unidentified woman was discovered in Provincetown during the summer, investigators began an extensive search to determine who she was and how she arrived in the dunes. Police reviewed thousands of missing person reports and examined records connected to vehicles approved to travel through the area. Despite years of effort, no confirmed match was identified. Investigators also noted that the sand surrounding the blanket appeared mostly undisturbed, leading some to believe the body may have been moved there after death. In 1979, authorities created a clay facial reconstruction in an attempt to generate new leads. The following year, the remains were exhumed for another examination, although investigators reported no major breakthroughs. In March 2000, the body was exhumed again for DNA testing. 10 years later, a CT scan of the skull helped create another reconstruction with assistance from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Each effort renewed public attention, but the woman's identity remained unknown. Investigators continued pursuing possible leads. One Canadian woman claimed her father had strangled a woman in Massachusetts during the early 1970s, although police could not locate her afterward. Another woman believed the reconstruction resembled her missing sister. Authorities also investigated missing fugitive Rory Jean Kessinger because of a possible resemblance to the victim. DNA comparisons later ruled Kessinger out, along with Francis Ewald and Vic Lamberton. In 2015, speculation emerged that the unidentified woman may have appeared as an extra in the film Jaws. Joe Hill brought the theory to investigators after noticing similarities involving clothing seen in a beach scene. Some investigators expressed interest, while others described the idea as unlikely speculation at the time. In 2022, investigators sent the unidentified remains to Othram for forensic genealogy testing. Scientists developed a DNA profile that allowed authorities to trace distant relatives connected to the victim. Through that process, investigators finally identified the woman as Ruth Terry, ending decades of uncertainty surrounding the Lady of the Dunes case. On the 31st of October 2022, the FBI field office in Boston publicly confirmed her identity, transforming the investigation from an unidentified homicide case into the documented story of a real person with surviving relatives and a traceable history. Attention soon focused on Ruth Terry's husband, Guy Rockwell Moldavan. Massachusetts State Police later requested information about him while reviewing his past. Moldavan had attended the American Academy of Dramatic Arts during the 1940s and was married several times over the course of his life. Investigators examined the 1,960 disappearances of his second wife, Manzanita Manzi Ryan, and her daughter, Dolores Ann Mearns, in Seattle. Moldavan became the prime suspect after both women vanished without explanation. Authorities also reviewed Moldavan's arrest for unlawful flight connected to the investigation, and separate larceny charges involving money taken from his third wife's family. True crime writer Anne Rule later discussed Moldavan in her book Smoke, Mirrors and Murder. Investigators had discovered dismembered human remains inside his septic tank, but could not prove they belonged to the missing women. Other cases linked to Moldavan included the killing of Henry Red Baird and the disappearance of Barbara Jo Kelly in 1950. On the 28th of August 2023, authorities officially named Guy Rockwell Moldavan as Ruth Terry's killer. The announcement closed a decades-old investigation and connected years of forensic examinations, family interviews, and unresolved disappearances surrounding Moldavan. For Ruth Terry's relatives, the identification finally replaced uncertainty with documented answers about what happened after her disappearance during 1974, ending decades without fate. In 1981, investigators examined possible links between the unidentified woman known as the Lady of the Dunes and Boston mob figure Whitey Bulger. Authorities considered reports that Bulger was known for removing victims' teeth, a detail that attracted attention because several teeth were missing from the victim. Despite the speculation, investigators never established a confirmed connection between Bulger and the Provincetown case. Another early suspect was serial killer Tony Costa, who had committed murders in Massachusetts during the late 1960s. Costa was later eliminated because he had been incarcerated before the body was discovered in July 1974 and died earlier that year while still in prison. Years later, investigators also examined statements made by convicted murderer Haddon Clark. Clark claimed responsibility for the killing and said he knew information connected to the unresolved case. He later sent letters, drawings, and a map that appeared related to the crime scene in Provincetown. One drawing showed a woman lying face down without hands, while another indicated a location connected to the discovery site. Authorities reviewed the material carefully, but remained cautious about Clark's claims. Investigators noted that Clark had paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that raised concerns regarding unreliable or false confessions connected to high-profile investigations. For nearly 50 years, the identity of the woman discovered in the dunes remained unknown. The investigation passed through decades of interviews, forensic testing, facial reconstructions, and unsuccessful leads before advances in DNA technology finally identified the victim as Ruth Terry in 2022. Investigators later named Guy Rockwell Muldavin as her killer in 2023. The case ultimately evolved from an unidentified homicide investigation into a documented history involving a named victim, identified relatives, and a suspect connected to multiple disappearances over several decades. Even after renewed attention and evolving forensic methods, many questions surrounding the case remained unanswered for decades. The identification of Ruth Terry provided investigators with a timeline that connected family accounts, historical records, and earlier investigative findings. Although several theories attracted attention over the years, authorities relied on forensic genealogy and documented evidence to identify the victim and determine the person responsible for her death. And from here, we step into the next case, where everything gets even more twisted. Kathy Sposito, a 3-year-old college student who loved nature and enjoyed hiking, went hiking alone on the morning of the 13th of June 1987 at Thumb Butte Trail in Arizona. During her hike, an unknown attacker assaulted her on the trail, turning a peaceful morning into a violent crime scene. Other hikers in the area reportedly heard Kathy screaming for help as the attack took place. By the time people reached the location, she had already died from the assault. Police responded to the scene and began an investigation into the killing in a public outdoor area. Investigators recovered key evidence, including a ratchet tool and DNA connected to the attacker. However, forensic technology in 1987 was limited, and the evidence could not identify a suspect. As a result, despite the physical clues collected at the scene, the identity of the attacker remained unknown. The case quickly became one of Arizona's unresolved murders, leaving investigators without a clear path forward. It remained unsolved for decades as the evidence sat in storage awaiting future advances in forensic science. Despite the tragedy occurring in broad daylight on a popular hiking trail, no suspect was identified at the time. The investigation focused on preserving evidence and documenting the scene in hopes that future technology might provide answers. At the time, DNA analysis methods were not advanced enough to produce a match or identify a suspect profile. The ratchet tool recovered from the scene was catalogued as potential evidence, but did not immediately lead to identification. Despite the collection of physical evidence and witness accounts from nearby hikers, investigators were unable to determine who was responsible for the attack, and the case remained unsolved for years as one of Arizona's most significant cold cases, leaving the investigation without resolution, despite preserved forensic material at the time. In the years following Kathy Sposito's murder, investigators continued to preserve the key evidence recovered from the scene, including DNA and a ratchet tool linked to the attacker. Although forensic material was carefully stored, the technology of the time was not advanced enough to identify a suspect from the available evidence. As a result, the investigation gradually lost momentum as leads failed to produce a name or breakthrough. Eventually, the case was officially classified as a cold case, with no confirmed suspect identified. For many years, Kathy Sposito's family remained without answers as the investigation stalled. The presence of physical evidence created ongoing frustration because it existed without yielding a suspect. During this period, Brian Scott Bennett was only 16 years old at the time of the 1,987 murder. He continued living in the area after the crime and was not linked to the investigation. In later years, he was responsible for harming other women in 1990 and 1993, though these incidents were not connected to Kathy Sposito's case at the time. Authorities did not identify him as a suspect in relation to the original murder during his lifetime. As a result, the true identity of the killer remained unknown for decades. The case stayed unsolved, with investigators unable to close it despite preserved evidence. Throughout these years, the preserved DNA and physical evidence remained in storage awaiting future forensic advancements. The investigation remained open in status but inactive in progress due to technological limitations. No arrests were made, and the identity of the attacker was not confirmed during this period. Despite the lack of resolution, investigators maintained the file as active evidence for future review. The murder of Kathy Sposito therefore remained unsolved for decades, with Brian Scott Bennett never charged during his lifetime, and the case remained cold case. Brian Scott Bennett was 16 years old at the time of Kathy Sposito's murder in 1987 and was never identified by investigators during the original investigation. He remained living in the same area after the killing and was not connected to the case by authorities. During this period, he later harmed other women in 1990 and 1993, though these incidents were not linked to Kathy Sposito's murder at the time. Authorities did not arrest him or publicly identify him as a suspect in relation to the case during those years. He continued living freely while the murder of Kathy Sposito remained unsolved for decades. In 1994, Brian Scott Bennett moved to Kentucky, and shortly afterward, he took his own life. He died before investigators identified him through DNA evidence and was never arrested or prosecuted for the crime. As a result, investigators lost the opportunity to question him directly or bring him to court. No information about his motives, mental state, or reasons for suicide is available in the case record. At the time of his death in 1994, the murder of Kathy Sposito was still officially unsolved. The connection between Brian Scott Bennett and the crime had not yet been discovered by investigators at that point. The case therefore remained open and unresolved, with preserved evidence still stored for future forensic review. Because Bennett was never identified during the early investigation, the opportunity to link him to the crime was lost for many years. His death in 1994 occurred years before DNA technology later confirmed his involvement in the murder of Kathy Sposito. This meant the investigation could not proceed to trial, and investigators were unable to question or prosecute him, leaving the case unresolved at the time until later DNA confirmation identified him posthumously in 2023, officially confirmed. The investigation into Kathy Sposito's 1,987 murder was reopened decades later. Investigators revisited the preserved DNA evidence using a modern forensic method known as genetic genealogy. Genetic genealogy was used to build a large family tree from DNA in order to identify possible relatives connected to the crime scene evidence. This approach allowed investigators to re-examine DNA evidence collected in 1987 with updated scientific tools that were not available at the time. The analysis gradually led detectives toward connections with the Bennett family through the genetic matches identified in the expanded family tree. Once this connection was established, investigators sought further confirmation by requesting additional DNA testing linked to Brian Scott Bennett. In August 2023, forensic testing confirmed that Bennett's DNA matched the evidence recovered from Kathy Sposito's crime scene. This confirmation provided the breakthrough investigators had been unable to achieve for more than 3 decades. The advancement highlighted how modern forensic science could solve cases that were previously limited by earlier technological constraints. Evidence collected in 1987, once considered insufficient for identification, ultimately produced answers through evolved genetic techniques in 2023. As a result of the DNA match, authorities were finally able to officially identify Brian Scott Bennett as the person responsible for the murder of Kathy Sposito. The use of genetic genealogy represented a shift in how cold cases could be approached using previously collected biological evidence. Investigators relied on the preserved DNA from the original 1,987 crime scene to generate new investigative leads through family connections. The Bennett family connection provided the critical direction needed to move the investigation forward after decades of inactivity. Once investigators focused on Brian Scott, Bennett legal authorization was obtained to conduct targeted DNA testing for confirmation. The resulting test in August 2023 confirmed a direct match between Bennett's DNA and the evidence recovered from Kathy Sposito's crime scene. This moment marked the first definitive identification of the killer since the case began in 1987. It demonstrated the impact of advancements in forensic science and how they could resolve long-standing unresolved investigations. After more than 3 decades, the evidence finally provided clarity in a case that had remained open and unsolved. Authorities concluded the investigation by confirming Brian Scott Bennett as the individual responsible for the 1,987 murder of Kathy Sposito. The resolution of the case highlighted how evidence preserved for decades can become crucial once scientific methods advance enough to reinterpret biological material collected at earlier stages of investigation. With Brian Scott Bennett identified through DNA comparison, the investigation into Kathy Sposito's murder reached its long-delayed conclusion, confirming that forensic advancements ultimately solved a case that had remained unresolved for more than 3 decades since 1987 case Haven.Ling.Mellison concluded. After DNA testing confirmed the match in August 2023, authorities publicly announced that Brian Scott Bennett was responsible for Kathy Sposito's murder. Although Bennett had died decades earlier and could never face criminal prosecution, investigators were still able to officially close the case through forensic evidence. The identification finally answered the central mystery that had remained unsolved since 1987. This resolution marked the end of a 6-year uncertainty surrounding the case of Kathy Sposito. For Kathy Sposito's family, the 2023 identification provided long-awaited answers after decades without knowledge of who was responsible. The announcement closed a chapter that had remained open since the 1987 murder on Thumb Butte Trail in Arizona. The case demonstrated how advancements in forensic science allowed investigators to resolve a cold case using preserved DNA evidence collected decades earlier. Evidence first gathered in 1987 ultimately became the key factor that led to the successful identification of the suspect in 2023. After 36 years, Kathy Sposito's killer was finally identified through DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, bringing official resolution to the investigation. Authorities confirmed that although the suspect had died years earlier, the scientific confirmation was sufficient to close the case administratively and document the official resolution. The announcement represented a final acknowledgement of responsibility based on forensic evidence rather than courtroom proceedings. Investigators emphasized that the preserved DNA evidence from 1,987 remained essential in reaching the conclusion decades later. The case closure highlighted the importance of maintaining evidence from cold cases for future scientific review. For the investigation, the identification of Brian Scott Bennett provided the missing link that connected the crime scene evidence to a named individual. This allowed the historical case file to be updated with a confirmed suspect through modern forensic confirmation methods. Kathy Sposito's family received the outcome of the investigation after more than 3 decades of uncertainty surrounding the murder. The resolution provided the official answer to a case that had remained unsolved since 1987. It marked the end of a long investigative process that began at Thumb Butte Trail in Arizona. The identification ensured that the case was permanently recorded as solved through DNA-based forensic confirmation. But the truth was far from over. Another shocking case was waiting. Holly Ann Campiglia was born in Cherry Hill. Camden County, New Jersey, to Augustine A. Campiglia and Sally Avery Campiglia. She grew up in a household with 4 sisters: Daryl Ann Campiglia, Dawn Campiglia, Jonna Campiglia, and Karen Campiglia. The focus of her early life remained on a stable family structure before any signs of emotional or behavioral changes appeared. According to her mother, Sally Campiglia, concerns about Holly Ann's well-being began while she was still a senior in high school. During this period, she began taking drugs and experiencing emotional problems that marked a significant change in her behavior. Her mother noted uncertainty about whether drug use or emotional struggles came first, highlighting the complexity of her condition. This period set the foundation for understanding her later behavior and the difficulties that would follow into adulthood. It remains strictly based on family testimony and documented early warning signs reported before her disappearance from stable family life. These early circumstances provide context for the challenges Holly Ann Campiglia faced during adolescence, as her family observed increasing emotional instability alongside behavioral changes that became more pronounced over time. Her upbringing in Cherry Hill and the gradual onset of emotional and behavioral difficulties during her high school years form the documented foundation of her case, establishing the timeline of events that preceded her repeated runaways and eventual disappearance from her family's day-to-day life as described in official family accounts and investigative records from the period leading up to her disappearance in 1980. In 1976, Holly Ann Campiglia was still a high school senior when her emotional and behavioral condition began to decline. According to her mother, this period marked the start of significant concerns within the family as Holly began taking drugs and showing increasing emotional instability. These changes represented a clear shift from her earlier childhood years, becoming the first major warning signs observed by her family. Her mother later stated that it was unclear what triggered the changes, noting uncertainty about whether drug use led to emotional problems or whether emotional struggles led to drug use. This lack of clarity highlighted the complexity of Holly Ann's condition and the difficulty her family faced in understanding what was happening to her during this time. The situation gradually worsened and would later contribute to repeated instances of Holly running away from home. This period is described as a turning point in her life, marking the beginning of a more unstable path that continued into her transition toward adulthood and college years. All information is based strictly on documented family statements and does not include speculation or additional interpretation beyond what was reported. During this time, her family continued observing changes in her behavior, noting increasing concern as her condition evolved and became harder to manage within the household environment. These observations remained consistent with earlier statements made by her mother regarding emotional instability and substance use concerns as reported in interviews later. In 1977, Holly Ann Campiglia enrolled at Glassboro State College in Glassboro, Gloucester County, New Jersey, where she pursued a bachelor's degree in fine arts. Despite this academic step forward, her emotional struggles continued and became more intense during this period, as documented by family accounts from that time. In the same year she began college, she ran away from home for the first time. This marks the beginning of a repeated pattern of disappearance and return that would define the following years, according to family statements. Over time, she ran away a total of 5 times, as reported in family accounts. The first incident ended when she was found approximately 1 month later, walking a mile away from her family home. Each time she returned, her mother reported that her responsiveness to medical treatment for emotional issues appeared to decline further based on later family recollections. This pattern caused growing concern within the family regarding her long-term stability and safety, as noted in family statements. The repeated disappearances created a cycle of separation and return that persisted through her late teenage years and into early adulthood, as described in the documented timeline, reflecting documented family reports over time, sequence of events noted. This section establishes the documented sequence of events that shaped her life after entering college and leading up to her final separation from her family in 1980, based strictly on recorded history throughout the documented case file records and chronology summary basis. It remains strictly based on family statements and recorded history from official accounts only sources. On that day, Holly Ann was in a car with her mother while being taken toward a counseling center. During the trip, she suddenly jumped from the vehicle near Route 70 by the Sheraton Post location, now known as 1450 Marlton Pike East in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Her mother recalled Holly Ann expressing a strong desire for independence, stating she wanted to get on with her life, see the world, and do things her own way. Despite her mother's attempt to hold her back, Holly Ann exited the moving situation and left the vehicle. Following this incident, her mother reported her disappearance to the Cherry Hill Police Department. Both parents attempted to locate her after she left. This moment marks the last physical interaction between Holly Ann and her family in New Jersey. This section remains focused strictly on the 10th of June 1980 event and the immediate aftermath, without introducing external speculation or unrelated developments. The incident became the final confirmed moment Holly Ann Campiglia was physically seen by her family in New Jersey, according to documented accounts. From that point forward, her whereabouts were unknown, and the family entered an immediate search phase as recorded in official statements. Her mother's report to authorities marks the formal beginning of the missing persons response in Cherry Hill, as both parents continued efforts to locate her throughout the following days, as documented later. In July 1980, approximately 1 month after Holly Ann Campiglia was last seen, her family received a letter dated July 1980. In the letter, she stated she was living with 2 men and instructed her family not to worry or think about her anymore. The return address on the letter was found to be false, and efforts to trace its origin were unsuccessful. The letter had been mailed from Sacramento, California, indicating she had traveled across the country after leaving New Jersey. During the same period, an administrative issue occurred in which Holly Ann's name was accidentally removed from the official missing persons computer list. This removal happened approximately 2 weeks before her body was later discovered, although this connection was not known at the time. At the time, the contents of the letter represented the only known communication from Holly Ann Campiglia following her disappearance from New Jersey. It reinforced the understanding that she had left the state and was attempting to distance herself from her family, as stated in the letter itself. No verified return address existed on the envelope, and all tracing efforts based on the provided information failed to identify a legitimate location. The administrative removal of her name from the missing persons system occurred without awareness of its timing in relation to later developments in the case. Together, the letter and the administrative error form the documented sequence of events from July 1980, representing the last confirmed paper trail connected to Holly Ann Campiglia before her remains were later discovered and identified years afterward subsequently. In the 3rd of August 1980, an unidentified female body was discovered in a cornfield in Dixon, California, located about half a mile north of Seavers Road and east of Stevenson's Bridge Road, approximately 30 minutes from Sacramento. The victim was described as a female between 15-17 years old, approximately 5'2" tall and weighing 115 pounds. She had brown eyes, brown hair, a small dark mole on the left side of her chin, and a distinctive punk rock-style haircut. She was wearing a green long-sleeved wool sweater and a light blue long-sleeved smock with a small white floral pattern. The smock had wooden buttons and was secured with a safety pin at the top. Observations noted that the clothing did not appear typical for the summer climate in that region. The cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds, specifically 6 shots to the head. The victim remained unidentified at the time of discovery. The location was described as remote, but positioned along a route between Davis and Vacaville. This section remains strictly descriptive of the scene, victim appearance, and cause of death as documented in the background information and investigative records from the original case file sources and official documentation only basis. On the 19th of June 1992, the unidentified victim discovered in Dixon, California, was officially identified as Holly Ann Campiglia, nearly 12 years after her disappearance in 1980. Her parents had previously relisted her as missing on the 12th of May 1992 after her name had been removed from the missing persons system years earlier. The identification was made with the assistance of the National Missing Persons Unit, which helped connect the recovered remains to Holly Ann Campiglia's case. Despite this confirmation, the investigation remained unresolved, and the identity of the perpetrator was still unknown at the time of identification. The case transitioned from a missing persons investigation into an active homicide inquiry, but no immediate resolution followed. Over the years, the lack of answers placed a lasting emotional burden on Holly Ann's family, who continued to live without closure regarding the circumstances of her death. Her sister, Karen Campiglia, died on the 11th of June 2009 at the age of 47 without learning who was responsible for the killing. Later, her mother, Sally Campiglia, died on the 3rd of July 2016 at the age of 83, also without receiving answers about the case. This section reflects the prolonged and unresolved nature of the investigation, which extended across multiple decades without identifying accountability. In 2021, Holly Ann Campiglia's family requested the Solano County Sheriff's Office to re-examine the original evidence in the case, prompting a renewed review of the investigative file by a technician to determine whether any materials could be retested for DNA analysis. A laboratory later identified male DNA from the evidence, a breakthrough that ultimately redirected investigators toward new suspect development in the long-standing case. This breakthrough eventually led investigators to Herman Lee Hobbs, who was already serving life sentences for multiple violent crimes, including rape and murder. Hobbs, aged 76 at the time of the later charges, had previously been convicted of raping a 5-year-old girl in 2000 and murdering 3-year-old Terry Patter in 1975. He was also linked to other violent cases, including the murder of Brenda Ann Tucker, although that case was previously dismissed due to lack of evidence. Following the DNA match, Hobbs was arrested in prison and transferred to county jail to face a charge of first-degree murder in Holly Ann Campiglia's case. The section also notes that authorities believe he may be connected to additional victims, and ongoing investigations are being conducted across Northern California. The original investigating deputy, Jose Joe Cisneros, was killed in the line of duty in 1985. The case remains active, with law enforcement continuing to seek further information. These developments marked a significant advancement in a case that had remained unresolved for decades, shifting the investigation from historical evidence review into active modern forensic analysis guided by DNA technology. The review of original materials, combined with laboratory findings, allowed investigators to connect long-preserved evidence with a known offender profile already within the correctional system. As a result, the case was reactivated within law enforcement channels and continued under formal review, reflecting the ongoing effort to address unresolved homicide cases in Northern California through updated forensic methods and interagency cooperation. Vicki Lynn Belk was a 28-year-old American woman living in Alexandria, Virginia. She worked as a federal employee at the United States Department of Agriculture. Her professional life was structured around government service and daily responsibilities within her office environment. She was also a single mother raising her 7-year-old son in Alexandria. Her routine was defined by balancing work at a federal job with parenting responsibilities at home. This balance shaped her daily life prior to the events that would later lead to her disappearance. She lived in Alexandria, Virginia, where she maintained both her household and professional commitments. Her role as a federal employee placed her within a structured government workplace setting. This setting later became relevant when investigators examined her last known movements. At the time, she was managing the responsibilities of both career and motherhood on a daily basis. Her identity in records reflects her as both a working professional and a parent in Alexandria. These aspects of her life formed the foundation of the case before her disappearance occurred. This period of her life represents the final stage before she was reported missing. She lived a stable routine life centered on work and family commitments daily. On the 28th of August 1979, Vicki Lynn Belk left her office in Alexandria, Virginia, after completing her work hours. She was last seen leaving her workplace in the city at the end of the day. After that moment, there were no confirmed sightings of her. Her failure to return home quickly raised concern among those aware of her routine responsibilities as a mother. She was subsequently reported missing after she did not arrive home as expected. Investigators later established this timeline based on her departure from the workplace in Alexandria. There were no additional verified sightings between her leaving work and the missing report. This absence created a clear gap in the record of her final known movements. The situation marked the transition from a normal workday to a missing person case. Given her role as a mother, the disappearance was recognized as urgent by those close to the situation. The short time between leaving work and being reported missing became central to the early investigation. It directly set the stage for what would be discovered the following day in Maryland. This brief window between disappearance and discovery defined the initial phase of the case investigation timeline in 1979 Maryland investigation. On the 29th of August 1979, Vicki Lynn Belk's body was discovered in a wooded area in Charles County, Maryland. Official findings confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted and shot in the head, establishing the case as a homicide investigation. The focus remained on documented facts, including location of discovery, cause of death, and classification of the crime. The brutality of the homicide was noted without adding any unnecessary graphic detail beyond the official information provided. Investigators quickly recognized the severity of the crime, documenting both the sexual assault and fatal gunshot wound. The wooded area location suggested the body had been moved or left in a concealed environment without further assumptions. This marked the shift from a missing person case to a homicide investigation within 24 hours of disappearance. It also set the stage for understanding early investigative limitations faced in solving such violent crimes at the time. From the moment the body was identified, law enforcement treated the case as a serious homicide investigation requiring urgent attention. No confirmed suspect information was available at this early stage of the investigation in 1979. The discovery marked a critical turning point as the case rapidly moved from missing person status to homicide classification. This transition shaped the direction of the initial investigative efforts conducted by authorities in Maryland at the time. It also underscored the limitations of forensic capabilities available during the late 1970s homicide investigations. These constraints would later contribute to the case remaining unsolved for decades despite ongoing investigative attention. It became one of many cold cases impacted by limited forensic technology of the era in 1979 investigations period. Following the discovery of Vicki Lynn Belk's body in Charles County, Maryland in 1979, investigators launched an immediate homicide investigation. Sheriff and police teams worked with the investigative tools available at the time, which were limited by the absence of advanced DNA testing and modern forensic technology. Despite active efforts, no suspect was confirmed in the immediate aftermath of the homicide investigation. The case was treated as a serious homicide investigation, but available leads did not result in a conclusive identification of a perpetrator. This reflected the investigative environment of the late 1970s, where law enforcement relied heavily on physical evidence, witness statements, and early forensic science techniques. These limitations often left significant gaps in complex homicide cases like this one. Investigators continued to pursue the case, but it remained unsolved during the initial investigative phase. This outcome set the foundation for the case becoming a long-term unresolved investigation. Without DNA technology available at the time, forensic comparison methods were extremely limited. Investigators relied primarily on witness statements, physical scene analysis, and conventional forensic procedures used in the late 1970s. No definitive breakthrough emerged from these early efforts, despite continued review of available evidence. As a result, the case gradually transitioned into an unresolved homicide investigation that would remain open for decades. The absence of modern forensic tools meant that evidence could not be analyzed with the precision available in later decades. This limitation ultimately contributed to the case remaining unresolved, despite initial investigative activity. Over time, this case became part of a broader pattern of homicide investigations, from the era that remained unsolved due to technological constraints, leaving investigators with preserved evidence but no immediate means to progress further, and setting the stage for future re-examination when forensic science would eventually advance in later decades ahead for renewed review. Following the initial investigation into the homicide of Vicky Lynn Belk, the case remained unresolved for nearly 4 decades. Despite continued investigative attention over the years, no confirmed suspect was ever identified. Law enforcement efforts did not produce a conclusive breakthrough during this extended period. The case gradually transitioned into a cold case as time passed without resolution. Preserved evidence from the original investigation remained part of the official case file. However, the forensic limitations of the era prevented full analysis using modern techniques. This evidence would later become significant when the case was re-examined decades afterward. Throughout the cold case period, there was no confirmed identification of any suspect. Investigators continued to maintain the file, but no new verified leads emerged. The passage of time significantly reduced investigative momentum on the case over decades. Despite this, the case was never formally closed by authorities during that period. It remained an open, unresolved homicide investigation within law enforcement records. The lack of forensic advancement at the time contributed heavily to the lack of progress. As years passed, the case became an example of long-term, unresolved homicide investigations. Authorities periodically reviewed the file, but no new breakthroughs were achieved. The absence of identification left the case open for future scientific re-evaluation. This prolonged period without resolution defined the cold case status of the investigation. Ultimately, the case remained unsolved until modern forensic methods allowed renewed examination years later. This long period of inactivity established the foundation for future investigative efforts when DNA technology eventually made it possible to revisit preserved evidence and re-examine the circumstances surrounding the original homicide case, with greater scientific capability available in later forensic review processes. Evidence collected decades earlier was subjected to updated DNA analysis methods that were not available in 1979. This section remains strictly factual, focusing on the process of revisiting old evidence rather than introducing new investigative theories. The renewed forensic approach represents the first major breakthrough in decades. The narrative emphasizes how technological progress played a critical role in reactivating the case and creating the possibility of identifying a suspect after such a long period. This renewed phase of investigation demonstrated how advancements in forensic science can reopen long-dormant homicide cases through reanalysis of preserved biological evidence. It also allowed investigators to apply methods that were not scientifically available at the time of the original 1979 investigation. As a result, previously collected evidence gained new investigative value under modern forensic standards, making it possible to generate leads that had been unattainable for decades. This development marked a critical shift in the trajectory of the case, transitioning it from a dormant file into an active forensic review process, supported by updated DNA technology. It signaled the first substantial opportunity in decades to re-evaluate physical evidence with scientific precision unavailable during the original investigation period. Ultimately, this stage of the investigation laid the groundwork for subsequent identification efforts that followed once DNA matching techniques were fully applied to the case evidence, marking a pivotal forensic advancement. In 2022-2023, law enforcement achieved a major breakthrough in the long unsolved homicide case of Vicky Lynn Belk through the re-examination of preserved forensic evidence. Modern DNA testing techniques were applied to biological material that had been collected decades earlier but could not be fully analyzed at the time of the original 1979 investigation. This renewed scientific review produced a DNA match to a suspect identified as Andre Taylor. At the time of the crime in 1979, Andre Taylor was approximately 18 years old and was reported to have lived in the same general geographic area where the crime occurred. The DNA match represented the first confirmed biological link between a specific individual and the decades-old homicide case. This development shifted the investigation from an unresolved cold case into an active suspect identification process. Law enforcement relied strictly on verified forensic results to establish this connection, without introducing assumptions about motive or additional circumstances. The identification was based entirely on the comparison of preserved evidence with modern DNA analysis databases and techniques that were unavailable during the original investigation period. This breakthrough marked a significant advancement in the case, demonstrating the impact of modern forensic science in resolving historical investigations. It also provided the first concrete direction in decades for investigators working to resolve the homicide case of Vicki Lynn Belk. Authorities confirmed the DNA comparison as a decisive forensic development in the case file, reinforcing the reliability of modern testing methods applied to preserved evidence. This identification became the central focus of further legal proceedings and marked a critical moment in the long-running investigation process moving forward at that time. Following the DNA match, Andre Taylor was arrested and formally charged in connection with the murder and sexual assault of Vicki Lynn Belk. In 2024, he was found guilty of first-degree murder and rape. The court proceedings resulted in a conviction based on DNA evidence and the associated legal process. He was sentenced to life imprisonment following the verdict. This section focuses strictly on the legal outcome and avoids speculation about courtroom dynamics beyond the confirmed charges and sentencing. The narrative highlights the conclusion of the judicial process, marking the resolution of a case that had remained open for over 4 decades. The life imprisonment sentence reflected the severity of the charges as determined by the court, concluding all trial-level proceedings. This outcome represented the final judicial resolution in the case of Vicki Lynn Belk, closing a legal process that had begun decades earlier with the original 1979 investigation and subsequent cold case status. It also marked the formal end of decades of legal uncertainty surrounding the homicide investigation. All determinations were based on DNA evidence and standard court proceedings, with no additional charges or separate findings reported beyond the convictions for first-degree murder and rape. The case therefore concluded at the sentencing stage, with life imprisonment imposed as the final outcome of the judicial process in 2024. No further legal appeals or alternative verdicts were recorded officially in record. After 44 years, justice was achieved through the conviction of Andre Taylor in the case of Vicki Lynn Belk. The long-delayed resolution provided closure for her family following decades of uncertainty surrounding the 1979 homicide. The conviction marked the conclusion of a case that had remained open across multiple generations of investigation. It reflected the final outcome of legal proceedings that began after DNA evidence linked the suspect to the crime. The case also led to the establishment of a scholarship foundation in Vicki Lynn Belk's name, created to honor her memory and preserve her legacy. This initiative serves as a lasting tribute connected to her life as both a federal employee and a mother. It reflects the impact of her story on her family and community, ensuring that her name continues to be remembered beyond the details of the criminal case. The Scholarship Foundation stands as a symbolic outcome of the case's resolution, focusing on remembrance and support for future generations. Additionally, the case is recognized as an example of how advancements in DNA technology can solve cold cases even decades after the original crime. The application of modern forensic science allowed evidence preserved from 1979 to be re-examined with accuracy that was not previously possible. This scientific progress played a central role in achieving a resolution in the investigation. The case ultimately represents both closure for the victim's family and the enduring impact of forensic innovation in modern criminal justice. It underscores the importance of preserving evidence for future technological developments that may assist in solving long-standing cases. On the 21st of March 1983, Christina Castiglione was officially reported missing by her mother in Redford Township, Michigan. This report marked the beginning of a case that would remain unresolved for decades. Christina was a 19-year-old woman living with her parents in Redford. She had graduated from Redford Union High School, where she was active in sports. At the time of her disappearance, she was not married but was in a steady relationship with her boyfriend. She was employed by the Detroit Edison Company, working as a clerk in the research department, and had recently made contact with an Army recruiter, indicating she may have been considering future career or life changes. The missing person report triggered an initial search and concern within the local community and law enforcement. However, at this stage, there were no immediate leads explaining her disappearance or whereabouts. This section of the case represents the final known point where Christina was last considered a missing person rather than a homicide victim. The investigation would soon shift dramatically as new developments emerged in the days following her disappearance. The lack of immediate evidence or witnesses made the early stages of the case particularly challenging for investigators. Briefly, on the 29th of March 1983, the Livingston County Sheriff's Office was alerted to the discovery of a deceased body in the Oak Grove State Game Area on Fawcett Road in Deerfield Township. Deputies responded to the remote wooded location and located the body of Christina Castiglione. She was found partially clothed, lying in an isolated area, indicating the crime had occurred away from public view and in a secluded environment. Law enforcement quickly determined that the circumstances surrounding her death were suspicious and required further forensic investigation. Detectives identified evidence indicating that Christina had been strangled. The investigation also confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted. During the autopsy, the medical examiner recovered male DNA samples from the victim. These biological samples were carefully collected and preserved, although at the time DNA technology was not advanced enough in 1983 to identify a suspect. This discovery shifted the case from a missing person investigation to a homicide investigation. The condition of the scene and the victim indicated a violent attack, and investigators began treating the case as a serious criminal matter. Despite the early evidence collection, the lack of technological tools meant the DNA evidence could not immediately lead to an identification. Following the discovery of Christina Castiglione's body, law enforcement launched a homicide investigation. Detectives gathered physical evidence from the scene, including the preserved biological samples collected during the autopsy. However, forensic science in 1983 did not yet have the capability to analyze or match DNA evidence in a meaningful way. As a result, the investigation relied heavily on traditional policing methods, witness interviews, and potential suspect leads. Despite these efforts, no immediate suspect was identified. Years later, in the early 2000s, the preserved DNA samples from the case were entered into CODIS by the Michigan State Police Crime Lab. CODIS, a national DNA database system, allowed law enforcement to compare DNA profiles across cases and known offenders. However, even with this advancement, the case remained unsolved. No matches were found, and the identity of the suspect remained unknown. The lack of a match meant that the case would eventually transition into long-term cold case status. This section highlights the technological gap between the original investigation and later forensic advancements, which still initially failed to produce a breakthrough. Investigators continued preserving evidence in hopes future scientific progress would eventually provide answers in the case for Christina Castiglione's homicide investigation efforts continued. For nearly 40 years, the Livingston County Cold Case Team and detectives continuously revisited the Christina Castiglione homicide. Over this long period, investigators pursued an extensive number of potential leads in an effort to identify the perpetrator. Despite sustained investigative work, no suspect was confirmed, and the case remained unresolved for decades. Throughout these years, detectives relied on evolving investigative techniques and periodically re-examined evidence as forensic science advanced. However, without a confirmed DNA match or clear suspect identification, progress remained limited, and the investigation often reached the same standstill. The preserved biological evidence collected in 1983 remained one of the few tangible links to the unknown offender, carefully maintained for future testing opportunities. The persistence of the cold case team reflected a long-term commitment by law enforcement to unresolved homicide cases, even as decades passed without resolution. The case continued to receive periodic attention as new forensic technologies emerged and offered potential avenues for progress. Each review of the file reinforced the importance of preserving evidence for future scientific breakthroughs. This sustained effort ultimately set the stage for renewed investigative action in 2022, when external funding made advanced DNA testing possible and reopened the possibility of identifying the suspect responsible for Christina Castiglione's death. These developments represented a turning point after decades of limited progress. It also underscored the importance of preserving forensic evidence for future advancements in cold case work. In March 2022, the Livingston County Sheriff's Office applied for and received grant funding through Season of Justice to pursue advanced DNA testing in the Christina Castiglione case review process. Season of Justice is a non-profit organization dedicated to funding DNA analysis in unsolved homicide, sexual assault, and unidentified victim cases, where DNA evidence remains the primary investigative resource used in cold case investigations. This funding allowed investigators to revisit the preserved DNA samples collected in 1983, with modern forensic technology preserved as evidence for later review. The grant represented a critical turning point in the investigation, as it provided the financial resources necessary to apply advanced DNA testing methods that were previously unavailable. The decision to re-examine the evidence marked a renewed investigative effort after decades of limited progress at that time in the case review process. With financial support secured, law enforcement prepared to submit the biological evidence for advanced forensic analysis for testing submission process. This development represented the first major breakthrough opportunity in decades and reopened the possibility of identifying the unknown suspect through modern science in the ongoing investigation process. This funding marked a significant shift by enabling renewed scientific examination of long-preserved DNA evidence in the cold case investigation process, moving forward again today. In May 2022, forensic DNA evidence from the Christina Castiglione case was submitted to Othram for advanced analysis in the ongoing investigation process as part of renewed forensic review efforts. Othram scientists utilized forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive genealogical profile from the unknown male suspect's DNA evidence. This advanced method allowed scientists to extract significantly more detailed genetic information than was previously possible within earlier forensic limitations. Othram's in-house genealogical team then used the resulting profile to generate investigative leads based on genetic relationships and ancestry connections within the cold case review process. Once these leads were developed, they were returned to the Livingston County cold case team for further investigation. Law enforcement officers followed up on these leads, continuing the renewed investigative process that had been reopened through advanced DNA review. This stage marked a critical shift in the case, as genetic genealogy provided new directions that traditional investigative methods had failed to uncover over many years in the ongoing investigation timeline. The use of advanced DNA sequencing technology represented a major breakthrough in cold case investigations. It transformed previously unusable biological evidence into actionable investigative leads, ultimately pushing the case closer to identifying the suspect responsible for Christina Castiglione's murder through scientific advancement in forensic analysis. This advancement significantly strengthened the investigative direction of the case. This marked a significant advancement in the use of forensic genealogy within cold case investigations involving historical DNA evidence in cold case resolution efforts. Investigative leads provided by Othram ultimately led law enforcement to the identification of a suspect, Charles David Shaw. His identity was confirmed through 3 separate familial DNA comparison tests, strengthening the reliability of the genetic findings. However, it was determined that Charles David Shaw had died in November 1983, meaning he could never be prosecuted or held accountable in a court of law for the murder of Christina Castiglione. This created a unique conclusion to the decades-long investigation, as the suspect was confirmed but legally unreachable. Despite his death, the identification provided long-awaited answers in the case. Law enforcement was able to close a major investigative gap by confirming the identity of the individual responsible for the DNA evidence recovered in 1983. The confirmation brought resolution to the question of who committed the crime, even though it did not result in a courtroom conviction. Although the suspect could not face prosecution due to his death in 1983, the identification still represented a significant milestone in the investigation, providing closure on the question of identity. It also confirmed that the DNA evidence collected at the crime scene had been correctly preserved and successfully analyzed through modern forensic methods. This outcome validated decades of investigative work by law enforcement and demonstrated the effectiveness of advanced genetic genealogy in resolving cold cases that had remained unsolved for many years. Even without a trial, the case achieved resolution through scientific identification, bringing definitive clarity to the long-standing investigation into Christina Castiglione's murder case finally. Investigators were unable to find any direct connection between Christina Castiglione and Charles David Shaw that would explain why she was targeted within the documented investigative record of the case file materials. However, through cooperation with Shaw's living relatives, additional background information was obtained regarding his life and behavior as compiled through investigative cooperation and case review. Shaw was a long-time Livonia resident who lived less than 5 miles from the location where Christina disappeared, as established through geographic context and investigative reporting documentation records. Family accounts described him as a sex addict with a disturbing personal history, as reflected in statements provided by family accounts. He was also reported to have struggled with mental illness and issues related to his gender identity, as reported within available investigative and family-sourced information records. His history included multiple interactions with law enforcement beginning at a young age, as documented in law enforcement records. One significant incident occurred in 1981 when he was arrested for the attempted abduction of a woman in the Fowlerville McDonald's parking lot, as recorded within prior arrest documentation case files. This prior criminal behavior demonstrated a pattern of concerning conduct before the 1983 homicide, as noted in investigative summaries. The cooperation of Shaw's family played an important role in helping investigators build a clearer profile of his background as part investigative background development. Their input was described as essential in confirming his identity as the individual responsible for Christina Castiglione's murder within case findings context. This section of the case highlights both his proximity to the victim and his documented history of criminal and behavioral concerns case overview. Christina Castiglione was 19 years old at the time of her death. She lived with her parents in Redford, Michigan, and had recently completed her education at Redford Union High School. She was active in sports and working as a clerk for the Detroit Edison Company in the research department. She was also in a steady relationship and had recently shown interest in a potential future with the Army through contact with a recruiter. The resolution of the case came nearly 40 years after her murder, when DNA evidence finally identified Charles David Shaw as the responsible individual. Although Shaw's death in 1983 prevented any legal prosecution, the identification provided answers that had long been sought by investigators and Christina's family. The cooperation of Shaw's relatives was considered essential in achieving this resolution. Law enforcement expressed hope that the closure in this case would provide some measure of peace to Christina's surviving family members. Additionally, the case stands as an example of how modern DNA technology continues to assist in solving long unsolved violent crimes. The ongoing use of advanced forensic testing is expected to aid in other cold cases nationwide. Christina Castiglione's case is now part of a broader effort to bring answers to families who have waited decades for justice and resolution. This case continues to be referenced within broader cold case reviews as an example of how preserved DNA evidence can eventually lead to identification even after decades have passed, reinforcing the importance of long-term evidence retention and collaboration between law enforcement agencies and forensic laboratories in unresolved homicide investigations.